At you. Okay. Ooh. Thanks, Jake. All right, so next up, our next speaker is Kevin Guennell from Mount Pleasant, Utah. He is the Habitat Coordinator of the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources, Great Basin Research Center, and Seed Warehouse, that's a mouthful, which serves as an informational and logistical center for landscape scale restoration throughout the state of Utah. The title of his talk today is Improving Establishment of Big Sagebrush from Seeding in Utah. Welcome, Kevin.
Hi, yeah, like Allison said, it's a long title. It's kind of a government thing. We like long titles. Anyway, so yeah, Kevin Guennell, going to be talking about some work looking at sagebrush, specifically that we've done over the last several years with Melissa Landine and Danny Summers work with me at the Great Basin Research Center and Seed Warehouse. Just to kind of outline a little bit of who we are, because we are kind of a unique entity. We're state-based wildlife agency, but we do serve, a multifaceted function of logistics and information for restoration work within Utah. And Utah is very proactive in their landscape restoration through the Watershed Restoration Initiative. We have targeted 100,000 plus acres treated proactively, not reactive to fires every year. And part of what we do at the Great Basin Research Station is, the habitat research, which we'll talk a little bit about today. Plant materials development, Melissa Landine covered a little bit of that yesterday in some of our forb and grass development there. We also, big part is that seed mixing and procurement process. We're second to the BLM in providing restoration seed. We annually do anywhere from 500,000 to 2 million pounds of seed for restoration work within Utah across all agencies. We provide to BLM, Forest Service, everybody within Utah. We also have a restoration equipment to put the seed out on the ground, as well as vegetation monitoring, long-term big game habitat monitoring, as well as monitoring within a number of restoration projects. So the failure side of what I'm going to be talking about today, big sagebrush, Artemisia tridentata. I think if you work in the Western landscapes, it's hard. We're losing it to fires, to other systems, and we're having failures getting it back from seeding. Not just my agency, but across the West, we've struggled to reestablish that after disturbances. Sorry, this is a little messy. I tried to update, and it's just didn't come out. But the data I had was old, and I wanted to update. This is from some monitoring data within Utah. So if you look on their post periods after seeding, and the y-axis is the percent of studies included. The N is how many studies actually take that, and then the x-axis is the amount of cover of sagebrush on those, and that should be less than 1% on the far left. But you can see, obviously first 3 years, most of it, our results end up in that far left column of less than 1%. But even out to 13 years, which we have less monitoring data out that far on the treatments, but even there, we're still having low success. A lot of sites that come back with less than 1% cover, even long term, though it is heartening to see that we are increasing, cover on a number of sites, but still fairly low. So what's limiting our success? A lot of things that have already been mentioned. I don't need to belabor this. Stella and Todd have covered it, timings, the way we're putting the seed on the ground. But largely it does come down to climate, weather events. Sagebrush establishment naturally is very episodic. It doesn't happen every year. Even seed production can be variable year to year in the natural system, and so that recruitment is an episodic event. So what do we do? These are just more examples within Utah itself of, pictures of fires come through, and we have success in reestablishing perennial grasses, but not the shrub component of what we're doing there. And so what do we do? But it is a mixed bag as well. Though limited, we do have areas where it's successful. Even though the monitoring data is showing low cover on some of these sites 7 years past, that we do see that component coming back into it, even though it's not registering necessarily in that monitoring data. The one up in the upper left is definitely the anomaly in a lot of our data there, and we were kind of wondering what did we do right here? And when we talked to the manager on this project, it was a mistake, that there was an equipment failure, that they were basically dumping sagebrush seed across this site at like 4 PLS pounds of sagebrush across this area. So that's one of our questions, is rate, that we'll get into. But I probably should have put this earlier, just talking the physiology or just characteristics of sagebrush seed. It's a very small seed. We're talking 1 to 2 million seeds per pound. Production for getting it out on the landscape, it's produced late in the season, harvested late November, and processing it to get back into the warehouse and out onto restoration projects. We usually don't get that until mid-December or January is normally when we can get fresh stock in. And it's sold in low purities, 30 PLS or per pound, or 30 PLS or percent PLS or less. Typically, it's short shelf life. It's hard to store. Needs cold dehumidified, and it's got little to no life in the seed bank. It's about 6 months is the documented seed banking on it. So getting into recommendations of what kind of, we know we're unsuccessful, so what are the recommendations and what we should look at? Recommendations like this, or were the standard: seed it on the snow, seed it late, January on the snow is the best. Seeding rates shouldn't be higher than proven successful, which in this case was 0.2 pounds PLS. So we need to differentiate bulk pounds and PLS pounds. That's another confusion I think managers specifically get into. Because this is such a low purity seed, normally we're about 25% PLS, like I said, seed. So we're talking in bulk pounds, that's a quarter of that is your PLS rate. In this 0.2 pounds PLS, you'd be talking, a quarter of that. So add a half pound maybe of seed. The recommended rates, this is just guides and things. Again, that PLS rate, we're less than 0.1 PLS pounds. This equates to about 50 to 100 seeds per meter squared is what these rates talk about. So quite low rates, except for that bottom one. In the reclamation world, they did say, get to 2 pounds or so PLS. And in our own world, we're looking, from what came from our own facility, usually we were seeding well at that 0.1% PL or 0.1 PLS per pound or per acre quantities. So we started looking at some trials quite a while ago in 2011 and how to improve sagebrush success. Looking at those recommendations and looking at what we can do to improve. The first attempt in 2011 was really cheatgrass control, seeding. It failed. Harsh climates, kind of some misapplication as well. So in 2013, we took a couple of different rates and went on to a couple of fires. This was actually one of the first projects I ever worked on. And that picture with the pencil there for scale is the one plant that I found in that trial. So that was great. So we thought, well, let's take it into a more controlled environment. And we went on one of our farms and we took a couple different rates and a couple of different dates. And 2014, it was like 70 degrees in February. We didn't get any rain that year. So absolute failure. We didn't see a single plant from that. So we thought, man, we're awesome at this. Let's expand it and do a little more. So we did 2 locations. They're within 30 miles, but they're climatically different. And we looked at 12 different rates, looking at that kind of standard 0.1 PLS, which is about 50 seeds per square meter, to 5 PLS pounds, upwards of 2,600 seeds, and then looked at different dates every 2 weeks through the season, and went out on the farm. We did it small scale within meter quadrat frames. Used rice hulls as carriers, just a Dixie cup with mixed in, and hand spread it. And then we also used a roller packer just to imprint before the snow, just to try to get some increased soil contact. I won't be talking those results. They were mixed, honestly. I don't know if it's just the farm setting or what, but I think there's something confounding going on there, and I don't know that we need to talk about it. But regardless, we've been doing this since 2015. We had good years, we had bad years. I'm really only going to highlight these 3 growing seasons. I'll mention too, we sampled in May for emergent, or early June for emergence for our counts. That does play in a little bit in that 2016-17 year. We did see good emergence early in the year, but we had a late freeze that really took out a lot of seedlings before we actually counted them. So, and you'll see that 2016 is almost not even worth looking at, but I put the data in here anyway. So when we look at seeding rate, so I'm sorry, I thought we'd be in a smaller room, so I didn't scale up these graphs, but all I want you to look at is the y-axis is density, the x-axis is our seeding rate. The different colors are dates, but I'm not going to get into that quite yet. But all I want you to see is, as we increase the seeding rate, it's really a linear relationship as far as increasing densities per meter squared of plants as we increase that seeding rate. When we transfer that to emergence data and compare that, and the graphs are our Ephraim site and our Fountain Green location. When we compare that to emergence data of density over our targeted seed per meter squared, we see that really flattens out. There's no real relationship. There's messiness in there. I get it at those lower rates, but really the take home from the seeding rate is we never hit anywhere where it was either beneficial or negative effect in seeding rate. And the more seed you plant, the more seed you put down, the more plants you get in this setting with limited competition. So season of seeding. You can see in the table there kind of what the seeding season relates to as far as month, date. The thing I'll just point out that, again, that 2016, 2017 was such low because counts that it really does. There is a relationship there, but it doesn't pull out at this scale very well. But you'll notice that fall seeding was what is significantly better on both locations in 2015 and 16, and in the Fountain Green location in 2018 to 2019. It gets a little messier in the Ephraim location in 2018, 2019, in that the early winter is the better. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit in relation to snow cover. So what we're looking at is the Fountain Green location. So this is all seeding rates averaged for the Fountain Green location. And on the x-axis, in the gray there, is our snow cover at the time of seeding. We just measured the snow depth and recorded that. And what you can see is a pretty strong demarcation of reduced emergence after the seeding, or after we get persistent snowfall on that location. And we see this as well at the Ephraim site that in 2015 or 2016. But then when we get that more ambiguous result in Ephraim, what we had less persistent snow throughout the season. And it's not necessarily reflected here, but we did actually have some other, we didn't measure it consistently enough, but there was, some blow-offs and returns of snow across the site. And we believe that's largely what's leading to the ambiguity on that site. So just a discussion, really that linear relationship, the more you seed, the more you get. I'd point out some of the literature. Jeff's artwork from 2017 really backs this up. The seeding rates of the normal seeding rate of 1x, or our typical seeding rate, is not significantly different than than a control without seeding would be. And we're really showing that as well, is that that's just not enough in the systems. We need to likely increase our seeding rates. The results on timing goes against the traditional recommendations of seeding on top of snow. At least in our systems, we need to be before that snowfall, and this has to go with germination timings, all of that kind of stuff, natural things. And so that's really the summary. But the point I'll make on that bottom one is it's episodic, and if weather doesn't cooperate, it doesn't matter. To Stella's point, the timing, it has to be there. And so that brings in a lot of other questions. We would like to ask the question about what's causing the mechanisms for the germination timing, figure out the soil moisture and temperature regimes that are required there, seeding methods, the seeding enhancement technologies, all of these questions, as well as timings for seeding of logistics, all of that kind of process. One thing I'd point out too is storage is important, because the seed comes off in November. We know we're going to have to store until the next year, so we've got to figure out storage protocols and do it right. And I'll leave it with that. I went a little long, so.
Hello. Any questions?
Kevin, have you taken a look to see what you were seeding in terms of subspecies? And
we did. I mean, we tried to. We didn't grow it in the greenhouse to fully verify or do any ploidy testing or anything, even of the seedlings. We did try to match label, and we tried to get some fairly local sourcing to our area, but sourcing could definitely be an issue. But we're fairly confident it was Wyoming sagebrush that was in there.
And have you checked the ones that emerged?
We should have, but we didn't. No.
Hey, thanks, Kevin. So one of the things that I think about, especially for these really long-lived plants in our systems that we're trying to restore, is when you think back to just the natural history of the species and the ecology of the species, it totally makes sense that, these things can live for decades and decades, right? And each year they have these teeny seeds, right? So they're producing thousands and thousands of seeds probably per plant, and they only need one of those millions of seeds that they produce over their entire lifetime to succeed, to replace that plant when it dies. So it's pretty wild. It makes sense that we would need to put a lot of seed out there to get just one plant, because that's what these shrubs are having to do. I was wondering, when you're thinking about what seeding rate you need, have you ever just looked to the system itself to ask, how many, what is the seed bank density around a sagebrush plant? What seeding rate is a shrub giving itself when it produces seeds every year? Just as a point of a place to start with thinking about what actually happens in the natural system and how many seeds are out there.
Yeah, my thoughts go the same way. Even when you look at these episodic events, this number of seedlings that you see come up and then thins out over time they're vast amounts. When it works, it works. But then even of those seedlings, how many of those survive. And to your point, there is some literature out there. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but you're right, it's in the millions probably, or at least hundreds of thousands of seed per square meter that are at least within a meter range around, that sagebrush plant, or that's likely the rates naturally occurring, but certainly we could mimic that. The other thing I'd say is we're putting these often in with competitive grasses. Even our native grasses can often be fairly competitive at the seedling stage against, sagebrush. And so in our restoration processes, separating out some of that and providing more safe sites for those seedlings to establish as well. So anyway, we're out, right? So, okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. So our next speaker today is Owen Baughman from Burns, Oregon. Owen is a restoration scientist with the Nature Conservancy in Oregon, where he works with a team focused on developing seed enhancement technologies for their use in restoration. The title of his talk today is Using Space and Time to Hedge Against Failure While Developing a Seed Technology for Dryland Restoration.
Thanks, Allison, and it's awesome to be here, and I'm excited to see so much happening in this space after a few years of not hearing from everyone. So, yeah, I just want to point out quickly that I work for the Nature Conservancy, but this work is really a pretty real collaboration between us and the USDA ARS out in Burns, and so I'm but a cog in this work. So I think we've covered this pretty well, and I don't need to go into it too much, but invasive annual plants are just a real threat to our sagebrush ecosystems, and they're one of many threats, which I'll get to a little later. But it's just this slow trickling of land from the top left of this photo collage to the bottom right, where introductions occur, disturbance happens, repeated fire can really accelerate this. But there's somewhere around 60 million acres of land just in the Intermountain West that are kind of in the bottom right of this photo, where cheatgrass and other annual grasses are dominant. And 60 million, we all know how to count to a million, right? But that's a really impossible thing to try to put in context. So I tried to base it around where we are here, which my Eastern geography is not that great. But if you look at just in the Intermountain West, where we have basically dominant annual invasive plants, that's the size of both Virginia's and Maryland here. And that's ignoring the places where these weeds are already present, but they're not yet dominant. So this is a really, really large scale issue. And so it's very well established that restoration is needed, and don't need to preach that here. But the consequences of not doing this right and not doing it right sooner than later is continued biodiversity loss, not only of the plants themselves, but animals for sure. Continued loss of economic viability for our local communities, even in ways we're not quite measuring properly yet. And then continued loss of ecosystem stability and services. And again, that's just, we don't know what these systems are doing for us, even outside this region, until we lose it. And I put continued in front of all those points because I think anybody who's worked in the system has, even if they're early on in their career, has seen places that they love or places that matter to them get degraded in a short time, which means it's happening really, really quickly. And another bummer is that these intact sites, as you can see on the left here, are carbon sinks, and they're actually new research coming out that there are more carbon there than we thought. And once they turn into annual invaded systems, they become sources. And then there's a million other things of why this is restoration is needed. And this was also already really covered well by our previous speakers, so that's awesome. But naturally in this region, recruitment from seed is challenging, and that's why we have so many perennial plants that live for a long time and just spit out seed every year. And I'm not going to go into the details here as much as I plan to, but there's just really high variability in how much of the right things these plants get. And so most perennial plants don't recruit every year, and they didn't ever, and we can't expect them to now. And so that means that restoration is just hard, and it's always going to be hard, even when we're doing it in the best way possible, which we are not yet. But the good news is that restoration efforts in the West are already large. We have economies and seed markets built around this. We have been doing this for a long time. You look at just the seed expenditures of BLM in the West alone, it's $10 to $20 million a year. over the course of even up and down years. And looking back to 1940, if you average the restoration effort, kind of broadly defined, in just Intermountain West, we're looking at 450, so almost 500,000 acres annually that we're doing stuff out there trying to make it better. And we all know that we're not succeeding as much as we need to, but this is awesome. This is an asset that we're already doing it at a great scale, and that's great, but success is limited. And when you look at the areas that we're actually restoring versus the areas we're trying to restore, the price tag on those successes is pretty high when you look at all the failure, but that's just the betting game that we're in the system. So one tool for dealing with invasive annual grasses is herbicide, and specifically pre-emergent herbicides, which temporarily can reduce invasive annual grass cover. And these are starting to get a lot more widely used across the western US. And these herbicides mostly work by restricting rapid growth of tissues, specifically roots, on small, tiny seedlings that are just germinating. And turns out native plants also have roots and are also negatively impacted by this herbicide if they're not timed well. And this applies to the seeds that are out there and then the ones we're trying to put down. So pre-emergent herbicide compatible seedings usually happen a year or more after the herbicide treatment. And successes can be had that way, but that requires going in there multiple years and it complicates planning scenarios. But it also, you never get, even the best herbicide application, you never get all the weeds. And so the longer you wait, the more likely you're gonna get back to a weedy system before those native plants are trying to do their thing and survive all these threats they have. So enter our seed technology, and R is I did not come up with this, I'm just working on it. Herbicide protection seed treatments are basically we're packaging seeds with activated carbon specifically and some other ingredients so that they can be protected from the herbicide because it gets adsorbed by the activated carbon. And in the diagram, you can see that the native plants happily shove their roots down below the protected area, and the weeds get impacted by the herbicides. That's the concept, and this concept was invented with agriculture, and it's been used for decades in agriculture. And our larger team has been working on this in one way or another for almost a decade, trying to adapt it in an intelligent way for native plants. And the concept works. You can see in the lab here where everything works and you feel like a genius, that unprotected seed plus herbicide, a few of them make it depending on their sites and safe sites that they get into. But when you protect the seed with activated carbon, and you put the herbicide on there, it's a major difference. This is like 40 days into a lab trial. So it works in the lab, and then in the field, well, it's a lot harder to measure the effect of these things in the field, and especially while we're trying to refine them, which is what I'm gonna talk about now. So the field is where we start to get into the concept here, which is a failure. And I'm happy to talk about failure. I've got lots to talk about. So our research goals with this herbicide protection seed treatments has been to just really maintain, or to establish proof of concept with native species in the lab and then the field, but also to adaptively refine them for their performance and the scalability of this, because we need these things to not only work, but we need them to work at a really large scale and be useful for people who need them. And then at the same time, as you'll notice from my, this is not an error in numbering, at the same time, we're working with industry and agencies to ensure that this product is feasible to produce and use. And once we get done working through all those things at the same time, which is a mess, we hope to demonstrate these at medium and then large scales and scale up kind of in a intentional way. So I'll talk a minute about what we've been doing when I refer to refining and optimizing with this. We've basically taken every possible thing about these and changed it and explored it. And starting in the top left there, we started with multi-seed pellets, which is a wet extrusion process. I can talk about all this later, but multiple seeds, and they're really large, they're really heavy, and they have a lot of carbon in there. And we tried different sizes of those, we tried different shapes, we tried different species, and then we've also shifted now to single seed coatings because they're a lot more conducive to use in current restoration practices. Along the bottom, you'll see different carbons. It turns out even really expensive activated carbons, they're all different. They have different chemical properties. They have different pH. There's lots there. And so I'm not a chemist, but we had to figure out how to find chemists to figure this all out for us. And we've also been experimenting with how to put these in the ground, whether you can broadcast them or, that need to be put into safe sites. And all of this, every single thing has been in the lab and then in the field, and I added it up, and it's over 350 different combinations of experimental factors just in the 5 or 6 years I've been involved with this. And so that's taken a while. If you've heard about this technology and you're like, where is it? Can we buy it? It's like, no, hang on. So our field testing, I won't go into the details here, but I just want to say that it's been an adaptive approach, and we've tried to make space and time our friend by spreading out lots of sites over many states where the sagebrush ecosystem occurs, and also trying to do things through time. But we've mostly broken those rules of the multi-year experiments where you're supposed to do the same thing over and over to get a good effect, but we change stuff every year because even though we're failing a lot, we're getting just enough information to figure out what's working better or worse, and then we abandon the stuff that's not working and quickly try to move on to new things. So it's been a real rodeo, but I will talk about a few of our things we found despite a lot of failure. So it's been real rich in failure, our learning journey with this, despite putting in this big space and time array. But these treatments work, and the concept works, but it really varies by year and site and species. And so the more of those things, sites, years, and species you can do through this learning journey, the better. But it just, this is because of the hit and miss nature of restoration out there. And I'll talk a bit about that in a sec. But the chemical properties of every individual ingredient does matter, because we're given these native plants a whole bunch of weird stuff they're not used to. So we really need to listen to them and understand what they don't like. And then the application methods too. If you try to coat a seed with too much stuff, it kind of messes up its natural cues, I think. So we also found the one thing that was clear was seeding in shallow furrows, kind of like what a drill seeder makes, was always better than broadcasting. And then we also, from a kind of a backwards way, learned that the exposure to herbicide, if you're an unprotected native seed, is just as bad as the presence of competition with the weeds we're trying to target. And this is not something we set out to learn, but it suggests that if we can master this protection and provide it to these native plants, it should be a real big boost, because competition is a real big barrier for them in these really invaded systems. And so a few more things here, and I mentioned it, that performance in realistic sites is just super difficult to measure when given this highly variable and success poor restoration environment that is just always going to be that case. And so toxicity from this herbicide is one of the many barriers that these plants are dealing with. And so when we're trying to identify that and get past that barrier, we have to contend with all the others as well. The multi-seed extruded pellets, the top two middle images there was what we started with, and they were very troublesome to produce and deliver at large scales. We started with a $4,000 pasta machine from Italy, and they worked really well through there, but it turns out when we try to make them at super large scales, as you can see from that weird machine thing there, we're trying to make thousands of pounds a minute there, and we did, but the seeds were getting chewed up, and try as we may, we could not adapt that process for our long, kind of fragile grass seeds. So they weren't worth the extra weight either, and they could impede some seed development, especially for small seeded species. So we moved towards single seeded coatings, and it was a viable alternative. In our early trials, they didn't work better than the pellets, but they worked the same, and they're 80% smaller. So let's go with that. Although I think the extruded pellets, talk to Todd, they've got a different thing and different problems and different resources. So for us, the single seed coatings look like the way forward. We also learned really the hard way that partnering with industry during rather than after refinement is super important, because you cannot underestimate or predict the bottlenecks of mass production that are going to come your way, or the needs of some of the industry folks. And not saying that our industry partners have been immobile in what they will do, but that needs to happen before you have spent a long time figuring out the thing, because you're going to have to change the thing when you try to make it at a larger scale. And so, failure was widespread across all of our treatments in many field trials. And, we had, similar has been talked about earlier, we had okay germination, but really poor early emergence, and then survival was often almost nothing. And you can see, even though we spread our sites across 5 different US states, some of the largest ones, 4 of the 5 years were severe or extreme drought, and that's also a bummer, but that's going to keep happening. So, and so our multi-year, multi-site experiments were critical in helping us learn just enough to get past this variable success and learn enough to move forward with this, but just barely. I've hired seasonal crews every year, and they get so excited to go out and look about how they're going to save the world, and we get out there and it looks like this, and it's just, there's no plants and no native plants, and our most common thing is just like having to, keep each other levied through the disappointment of constant failure. Even a really big attempt to try to spread this all out barely worked. So that was a major lesson learned. And then even when our tool is perfected, which it's getting pretty close, and when I say perfect, it's like as perfect as possible, success of it will have to recognize multiple barriers because there's a lot out there. And so you're gonna have to address these barriers specifically with different tools, which leads me to my final points here, looking towards the future of extra and more failure. This is going a little bit beyond the work I've been talking about right now, but after, my short career, these are some absolute truths I think that I'm settling on, that if you can keep them in mind, it will reduce the failure that you're going to occur. It's not gonna remove it, but even the best single tools are bound to fail pretty often. And each best tool it can only offer incremental improvement in this system. There's nothing that's gonna just jump you on its own a huge gap. So even if they only are helping a little, if they're consistently helping, they're good tools. And the confidence in these tools will be lost by managers and practitioners and lawmakers, whoever, if they're sold as or considered or talked about as if they're gonna work every time, because the second you start using them, you're gonna realize they don't work every time, and that you don't want that to reflect poorly on the tool if it really is a good tool, because we can't help that hit and miss success. So, success that's consistent across a program is only going to come about from stacking up a bunch of prescriptions that are all addressing different barriers. And so how this relates to the seed treatments I've been talking about is that once they're out and available for use, strict production specifications early on is going to be really critical to maintain the success that we've built into them. And their use has to accompany other best practices because they do not make it rain. They just help protect from herbicides. So I think that is it. I just want to recognize we've got support from agencies, and we're partnering with Germain Seed Technology, which is a seed coating company that's really helped us out a lot. And with that, I can take questions if there's any time, but I don't think so because I talk a lot.
Hello. There's time for at least one question. Anybody? Any questions?
All right, we fixed it.
Yeah, thanks for embracing your failures today. Yeah, I love it. If you do have questions for him, we have like 2 minutes. Oh, Beth has a question. Hey, Owen. Is that okay if Beth has a question? Is this working? Yeah.
It's coming from my former advisor here. Watch out.
I know, I always ask my students mean questions. So do you have any desire to build one of those beautiful test shelters like Todd has so you can learn faster? Do you know what I mean? Because I want that.
I desire to have one built for me, yes.
Me too. And that has to be cheaper than all this failure, right? Like, why don't we have that?
I mean, you and I both know that every time we've tried to get past some of these barriers by adding water in the most realistic way possible, or I don't know, it's hard to really remove these important barriers that are causing failure in a way that still turns whatever you're researching into enough of reality that what seems like it's working will actually work, and that's the challenge. And I think those are some of the best ones I've seen, and so I think we should hear about that some more. Get some plans and have some people who have money to spend build them in networks across the West, because we desperately need that for sure. Because it's not easy to do that well. You can't just start adding water and pile up some dirt and call it a site that will lead you to success. They're actually very hard to do in a way that's realistic. So otherwise, it's just another lab experiment, and it tells you things that aren't real.
And we'll have time for more questions in about 20 minutes. So we'll join our last speaker for today with Peter Stanton. He is the leader of the Walker Basin Conservancy and its mission to restore and maintain Walker Lake. As the executive director, he provides the vision and leadership for a pioneering restoration project. And the title of his talk is Native Plant Restoration and Water Availability in the Walker Basin. Welcome.
Awesome. Thank you, Allison. Excited to be here today. Again, Peter Stanton, Executive Director of the Walker Basin Conservancy. And today we're going to quickly walk through what we do at the Conservancy and how native plant restoration is leading to saving Walker Lake, a giant desert lake in Nevada. Our mission at the Conservancy is to restore and maintain Walker Lake while protecting agricultural, ecologic, and recreation interests throughout the basin. And to quickly orient everybody, the Walker Basin spans the California and Nevada state lines and falls with the the Carson Truckee watershed to the north and Mono Lake to the south. And since European arrival, we've seen a complete collapse of Walker Lake. So since the 1850s, Walker Lake has lost 90% of its volume, 50% of its surface area. It once supported half of the Mineral County, Nevada economy. And today it is in a state of complete collapse. This is due to upstream diversion for agricultural irrigation within the Walker River Basin. As the inflows to the lake have declined, the lake level has come down. The water evaporates out of Walker Lake, but the salt does not. And today we see complete ecosystem collapse with the increasing salinity in Walker Lake. The last Lahontan cutthroat trout was caught in 2009. It used to be the largest stopover point for loons west of the Mississippi. The last Loon Festival was held in 2009 as well. And that's led to economic collapse within Mineral County, Nevada as well. There is a way to reverse this, and that is to protect water instead of diverting it for irrigation, protecting it in stream in the Walker River and on to Walker Lake. And that is our main work at the Conservancy. We acquire agricultural water rights and protect them in the Walker River for ecological benefit. As we do that, we improve habitat on former alfalfa monoculture, we increase public access, and we provide resilience to the agricultural community as we increase the flows of the river. So to date, we have acquired 26,000 acre-feet per year. That is more water than has been acquired for environmental benefit in any watershed in North America that we know of. So a very ambitious project. We've provided public access to more than 29 miles of the Walker River corridor on land that was closed to the public since sometimes the 1860s. And we have really pushed and pioneered a lot of dryland restoration techniques. So our goals when we're pursuing this are to reestablish native plant communities and put them on a trajectory to match reference sites long term. We're not going to accomplish that in 2 to 5 years, and that's typically the window that we have to get these native plant communities on a restoration trajectory. We also, have very clearly articulated goals of soil stabilization, dust abatement, and weed control as well. So we've got some pictures of reference sites on this slide. A couple of things I'd call attention to. It is an incredibly arid environment. We get less than 5 inches of precipitation annually, dominated by low elevation salt desert communities, plant communities. These communities have relatively low resistance to disturbance and low resilience as well, and a long history of that disturbance. So you see some pictures here of what a reference site in the Walker Basin would look like. This is an example of a field when it was acquired by the Walker Basin Restoration Program. So this is a former alfalfa field in Mason Valley that had not been cultivated for a number of years prior to acquisition by the program. And it's indicative of a lot of the fields that we get. There's a huge agricultural weed seed bank in this soil. There's intensive soil compaction and high soil salinity, both from the intensive use and the geologic history of the area. So this is one of the first projects that was undertaken for revegetation. That was originally done in a joint venture between the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and a local conservation district. And so you can see market improvement. This is the same site about 10 years later. You see market improvement here. You still see low shrub density, a lack of ground cover, and frankly a lack of species diversity as this goes forward. Those projects started in about 2012. In 2015-16, several large ranches on the East Walker River were acquired, and thanks to actually Beth Ledger and some of the research that went into initial trials out there, we were able to start developing better practices for that revegetation long term. So this is pulled from a paper by Dr. Ledger, 2016, on Rafter 7, one of the East Walker properties. So what you see on the right-hand side of the screen here is the second year in spring and then in fall of irrigated seeding of shrubs and grasses. And we'd love to say that look at how all of these great native plants came up in the spring, but what you're looking at there is almost entirely agricultural weeds in that bottom picture. So there is an incredible load of agricultural weeds in these soils, and especially as you bring irrigation to bear, they very quickly dominate any of the fields that are seeded. That study also highlighted the importance of local plant material and informed the revegetation that we've done on the East Walker to date. So the Conservancy is actively managed in partnership with Nevada State Parks, approximately 5,000 areas of floodplain and upland fields, mainly former alfalfa monoculture. Through these projects, we've used drip irrigation wherever possible, and we'll go through this, but we have used irrigation in many forms. So I'm gonna run through basically 5 lessons and key takeaways from this project. The first is that it can be done. We plant at rates to establish these plant communities if we get 25% 2-year survival of seedlings. We have accomplished up to 75% survival in many of these fields. At a 5-year time horizon, we've seen shrub cover increasing and invasive species cover reducing over time. And we're also seeing significant secondary recruitment occurring within that 5-year timeline as well. Lesson number 2, we could not buy enough plants to do this successfully at first. So whether we're talking about seeding a diverse species mix, seeding very locally sourced seeds, or putting seedlings in the ground, we couldn't obtain plant material for any of that. And what came of that is basically a completely vertically integrated plant materials program at the Walker Basin Conservancy. So we wild collect seeds, we germinate, propagate seedlings, put them in the ground ourselves. We've seeded from wild collected seeds directly, and have seen significant increases in 2-year survival and then overall restoration trajectory based on the origin of the plant material itself. Lesson number 3, big takeaway here. Shrubs are not grasses, and they have different needs. So we have found, in terms of actual on-the-ground impact per dollar we invest, that transplanting seedlings for shrubs and forbs is the most economic way to do that. We then aim to irrigate those shrubs as directly as possible for 2 years. That gives these plants the chance to establish in this really arid environment, and then when we pull that water back, they'll over time outcompete weeds and be on a trajectory to establish the dominant plant communities. With grasses, we seed grasses, and then whenever possible, use broadcast or sprinkler irrigation for grasses. We've found it's much more beneficial and cost effective to separate either spatially or in terms of time grasses and shrubs. So you can see an example of that here where we've got shrubs established on drip lines, grasses established in between those areas of shrubs. Water is probably the biggest tool that we have at our disposal in the Walker Basin. We're able to irrigate almost all of these projects, and that is a blessing and a curse, because as soon as you put irrigation on one of these former alfalfa fields, you see alfalfa coming up, you see and a whole host of agricultural weeds coming up with it. So our priorities there, again, are to irrigate for 2 years, pull that water back, and we're doing everything that we can to apply that water as precisely as possible. So drip irrigation, while more labor intensive and capital intensive, is actually more cost effective in the long run for us, because it allows us to water the shrubs that we want to and not an entire host of weeds around those projects as well. And that makes such a difference in the overall outcomes for us that we really heavily prioritize projects where irrigation is an option, and are very skeptical to take on dry seeding projects in the Walker. And lesson number 5, weeds take work. The number one thing I'd say on this is to know your priorities. We had several years of our partnership with the state park, where the state park told us, you can't just let this alfalfa die while you put these revegetation projects into effect. And so if you have competing goals, it makes application of herbicide and targeted irrigation incredibly difficult. Active weed suppression is absolutely needed to establish these plant communities, is what we found. We've used a variety of approaches, including mechanical, chemical, but our biggest has been water management. So to recap and kind of look at how this can work outside of the context of the Walker Basin as well, number one, it can be done, but these projects are resource intensive. I mean, Owen's presentation made allusion to this. This is significantly more cost effective than an aerial seeding project. It's intensely place-based. We use plant sources with local genetics, and every single field has different irrigation concerns as well. But it's something that you're going to see more throughout the Western United States, and there's going to be an increasing need for this. We see, this is a picture of Lake Mead from last year, and you've seen significant investments in reduction of irrigated acreage in the Colorado River Basin. You're gonna see this in California's Central and San Joaquin valleys as their groundwater management comes forward. And so it's important to understand and learn from some of these really challenging fields that we've revegetated as we move towards optimizing where we're irrigating agriculture in the West. And I'd be reticent to miss the opportunity for some plugs for the future for the Walker Basin Conservancy as well. As I mentioned, we developed this entire vertically integrated plant production supply chain, and we're expanding that significantly. both in terms of our nursery capacity and our seed collection capacity as well. We're also converting one of the farms that we purchased to native seed production in an effort to essentially serve as a demonstration of how we can keep former alfalfa fields economically productive as a model for reducing water usage in the Walker Basin. And if you want to be a part of that, we're hiring a native seed farm manager as well. So happy to take any questions, and thank you for the chance to present today.
Hey, I really liked thinking about this because it's very different than the systems I tend to work in, because you have irrigation available and they're old agricultural lands mostly. And I wondered if you had thought a little bit about the reference sites that you're using, and since this is such a different situation with the agricultural field, whether or not you might start from a different place with plant communities and then try to nudge it towards those, say, undisturbed reference sites, or if your reference or your sort of target should change based on that soil disturbance. I mean, it's not all that, in some ways it's like a lower level of maybe what would happen with a reclamation for oil and gas or whatever else in the area. And it's certainly relevant maybe to BLM as well, and older sites that were tilled for, say, other planting purposes in the past. So yeah, anything about that reference site stuff?
Yeah, definitely. So the reference sites that we typically select as goals for these restoration trajectories are valley bottoms, so similar elevations nearby, right? And I completely agree. It's going to be centuries before the soils in a former alfalfa field look anything like what a typical valley bottom in the Great Basin is going to be. I don't know of any examples of potential reference sites with that kind of aridity and these kinds of soil disturbances that are on anything resembling a restoration trajectory. And so, you know, again, we target nearby fields of similar, similar elevations, aspects, that kind of thing. But understand that this is going to be a decades-long process to get anywhere near that.
We have a question over here, Peter.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask if you've done any partnerships with the Walker River Paiute tribe, whose reservation spans much of the Walker River and portions of Walker Lake. I think that would be another indicator of success and failure, is how well we integrate with our conservation efforts with tribes. But just to add on to that, there is something to be aware of with the Lahontan Regional Water Quality Board in Eastern California, where they've got an effort to look at tribal beneficial uses of water and cultural beneficial uses of water. So it's a little bit aside from the plant part of it, but certainly it could be a strategy within that larger goal of conserving Walker Lake. But to be included, that would have to be a tribal effort in that to establish those uses along the Walker River. And because the Walker River is in the headlands, or the upper watershed is within California, then that's certainly something to consider jointly with the tribes in an effort to better that region.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. We work closely with the Walker River Paiute tribe. On this map, you can see that uppermost point of the river is Wabusca, which is really where the reservation starts. So the last, I think, 25 miles of the Walker River flow through the Walker River Reservation. And we, during the irrigation season, work with the tribe on a daily basis on administering program water through the Walker River and the reservation onto Walker Lake. We're also working with the tribe on several riparian restoration projects on the reservation, intending, prioritizing stream bank stabilization and water quality as we get more water moving through that stretch. It's actually pretty amazing. So that stretch of river on the reservation has gone dry basically every summer for the last 70 years. And through this program, we're able to basically turn the river back on and protect water and keep it moving through that stretch of river that has historically been incredibly impaired. And then in terms of tribal beneficial use, it's a great point. It's something that a conversation I've started with the tribe as well. We've seen it at Mono Lake, tribal beneficial use brought up in terms of the public trust re-adjudication that's going forward. And I would love to see the historic uses of the Walker River tribe recognized and accounted for in the protection of water through the system as well.
Okay, I think that's the end of our official session, but we do have 20 minutes with the speakers, so if you have some unofficial questions for any of the speakers, we'll take them now. Thank you, Peter. Did you have a question? Oh, don't be embarrassed. What was your question? Who was it for?
I had two questions. I'm not an ecologist or a grower, so I feel like I'm just a foreign visitor in this whole event. But I had one question for I forget your name, the guy from Australia. I just wondered, I feel like at this convention, it's very easy to get excited about finding bold solutions, and I thought it was interesting, the speaker yesterday in the morning, reminding us to be kind of humble too about the way we imagine we can modify a whole environment. And I wondered if, from an Australian perspective, you had maybe a different POV or different advice for us Americans trying to do this work.
Yeah, you say you feel like a foreigner. I think I'm the biggest foreigner here because I'm probably the funniest accent going around. Yeah, it's hard. The fully modified landscapes that we work in, it gives you the chance to operate from a clean slate. People quite often say with us, oh, we're working with the mining, it's the big end of town, the money's available to be able to do these things. But the one thing we are focusing on with unpacking it and working with people like the engineers to create new machinery is to make it available to the whole market. So I've been traveling here since 2010 every year, and America's my second home. And that's the whole idea of knowledge exchange and being able to do these things. So Beth brought up a good point about our rainout shelter. That rainout shelter was a bit of infrastructure that was easy for the mine site. It is a standard dome nursery setup with open walls, so it mimics our landscape. And I guarantee you that is, like people say, oh, it's, because we're trying to get from the Petri dish to the glass house to near natural to real world. Everyone said, oh, but it's still not real world. I'm like, I guarantee it's real world, because when you're sweating out of parts of your body that you never knew you could sweat out of, the conditions in there are identical to our rehab sites. But that facility and turning around science quickly to satisfy our mining sponsors for their needs, but the greater good of science, there's one example I showed with all the seedlings growing. We did 100 restoration scenarios in that one trial in 6 weeks, versus that failed trial was one site, one soil type, multiple months of effort for nothing. So that one facility speeds up our science. So having that ability to muck around with a range of aspects and unpack the whole system, to me, I'd love to see it replicated here. But yeah.
Did you have a second question?
Sorry, I'm gonna keep you hostage. I was just wondering too, because I keep hearing the word precision. I guess maybe this isn't specifically for you, but I keep hearing precision, and I do come from more of like the conventional ag and landscaping and stuff. And so I was just wondering if there's any exciting things coming out of precision agriculture that you hope this endeavor of native
seed production can bring over to your side.
Yeah, the precision ag side of things, when we've teamed up with mechanical engineers, and it's been a great translation for us working with engineers, because I am just a plant biologist, seed biologist by trade. When we've looked at the precision ag, and any glossy brochure you see from a precision ag show, the precision is still plus or minus too much for some of our native seed needs. So when Monty Masseray was the main student and person leading that conversion of agricultural direct seeders to the needs of our seeds, that plus or minus, a standard precision ag drill disc aims to get a wheat seed at 5 centimetres, but it's plus or minus that 5 centimetres, so it can go anywhere from 0 to 10 centimetres. That 10 centimetres is too deep for us. So when we looked at what was on the market, that was look at what's there, does it work? If not, can you customise it or modify it? And we've got down to that layer of precision. So our precision is now, we're aiming for the top 10 mil to 20 mil. And it's utilising what's on the market, but tweaking it for your system. So our precision seeders are aiming for that and understanding the elements that would make a traditional ag bit of gear fail in the mine sites, and it's rocks that are this. So that precision, it's a word that everyone uses now, but it needs the seed precision from the biological front, but also the machinery to be able to handle that at the scales needed.
Thanks for a great presentation, and presentations for everybody. And Allison, thanks for putting together such a great forum. I think we don't focus on some of this stuff enough. My question is scaling failure and being able to take opportunities from some of the current funding that we have, and if there's ideas or ways that we can maybe have some rapid improvement in some of this failure with the availability of funds, and if you guys have ideas. And maybe I'm more planting a seed for conversations later on, but I just think that there's an opportunity, and maybe if you guys feel like there's some options or regional groups that we can be supportive of finding that.
This is Stella. I mean, there's probably lots of answers here for that, so maybe I should pass the mic around, but I would kind of punt to the National Seed Assessment and say that they were really recommending coordination among agencies and effort. I think that would be really helpful, as well as coordination research efforts. Unfortunately, sometimes there's kind of a lot of bureaucratic stuff in the way for people to work together, but also, different incentives and things like that. And having people whose job it is to actually do that scaling and work across not only agencies, but universities and the implementation side and the growers, even that would be really helpful. That's one thought I had. Does anyone?
Yeah, I'll just, to that point of the coordination, I alluded to this within Utah, but there is a framework that's in Utah, the Watershed Restoration Initiative, that largely does what Stella was talking about, cross-agency work. We don't look at fence lines, we try to work across fence lines. It's really, if you look at the acreage done in Utah of restoration work, it's unparalleled because of that coordination effort there. But to build on what she's saying, what I'd like to see built into that is it's more or less a working laboratory, and we haven't built in the infrastructure of research to build into that. The land managers and project managers are more than welcoming to research. We're even putting in a proposal to take some of the seed enhancement technology to scale within those projects in real world scenarios. But a coordinated effort among the research entities built around those landscape scale projects is something that could definitely be developed. But it does take an entity to administrate and to prioritize and to run that, and also letting go of egos and working with people that you maybe
would view as competition or otherwise as well. I'd say we've got to get past that institutional bias to some degree. So.
Yeah, and I mean, speaking as a NGO partner in this space right now too, I mean, we have approached multiple land managers and said, we can gather, grow, and plant out plants for these key restoration areas on your land that meet these, and we can fund it with this funding source, and gotten answers from them saying, we don't have the capacity in our office to administer another agreement. And so we've got all of this money coming down from the federal level and very big funnels at local and regional office levels in terms of getting that out into the field. The other thing that I would say, one of the things that we're working on at the Conservancy is increasing just increasing the germination and propagation capacity for seedlings, especially for Mojave Transition Area and Great Basin plants. You can't go out and buy a lot of these right now, and we're working with land managers and then tribal partners as well. And what we want to do is be germinating this stuff and propagating it and getting it so that people can keep it in their own shade structures, grow them to size themselves, but to develop kind of a regional hub where we can overcome some of these shortages, especially for shrubs and forbs in the Great Basin.
I'll just add one more thing from a foreign view. Noticing, I think, I'm getting a sense that money is coming in because something happened with your higher levels. You can have a lot of money and waste a lot of money, or you can have that money and use it very efficiently. I think one big thing that's missing from a lot of these scale-up programs is the academics get stuck as academics and the applied people get stuck as applied. And one thing we're missing is that coordinated, embedded research inside the scale-up. So every time you do an experiment, they speak to each other. So you can have academics doing academic work, but it speaks to all the goals. And embedded experimental designs in the big matrix is still the one big thing that's missing. So if you had the money to think about a coordinated approach, I would hope that that embedded design is there so you don't get confounding issues of every time, like Owen driving around all the states, there's always something different that happens there. But if each of the designs have that thought in mind, by unpacking whatever it is, if it's the germination phase, the seed enhancement, the machine, the company that provided this, the source being plant material, whatever, embedded coordination, I think, is a thing that hopefully can be pushed for.
Any more questions? Oh.
Hi, thank you all for speaking today. I'm a native plant grower from Montana, and we grow a lot of big sagebrush. It's probably our biggest crop, and we're putting tens of thousands of sagebrush back into the environment every year. And so the sagebrush conversations were, of really great interest to me. I guess my question is, I was really intrigued by both of the gentleman from Utah and the gentleman from Nevada, since those are both landscapes that we send plants to. One of my questions is, how much is Utah looking at transplanted seedlings versus seeding in sagebrush, and what is that difference of survival that you're seeing if you're doing that work? And then in Nevada, in the Walker River or Walker Lake Basin, from an economic standpoint, is transplanting sagebrush, does it, ecological and economical, does it make sense if you're not irrigating it?
So yes, we are actively looking at seedlings and transplanting. There's a large effort there. We're looking at both the increasing capacity for providing seedlings, as well as increasing mechanization to put it out onto the landscape. Largely what the limitation there, we are finding good success. We've got a partner with the Rocky Mountain Research Station who's really looking into this. we've developed some pretty crude protocols that we can go out and punch holes and plant. I want to say we were doing 2,000 plants an hour, I think is what they were hitting across landscapes. Yeah, so I mean, we're talking of taking automation and getting to scale. But even with that scale, the scale of need, we're never going to get away from seed either. Fire rehab in particular, when you're talking mega fires of 50,000, 100,000 acre plus fires, transplant's not going to be there. Successful, yes, it's more successful, absolutely. But can we also, it's again the question of can we make seeding more effective as well, incremental increases, and find success where we can't do transplanting, remoteness, whatever the reasons there. And so yeah, it's using every tool that you can come up with, and I think we're all in that boat of if there's a chance it's going to work, we're going to try it until it's not working, and until we know it's not going to work. And so yeah, any of that absolutely. But I do think, again, coming back right now, that industry is just building. We don't even, I mean, you can speak to this, the infrastructure for even providing the quantities of seedlings to do actual full landscape scale. It's the logistics are difficult, and it's so it's not there yet, but it's definitely going to be a tool coming forward.
Yeah, I'd echo almost all of that. So in the Walker specifically, big sage is not an ecologically appropriate shrub for many of our sites. We do see tridentata on hillsides, but very rarely in valley bottoms at these low elevations where we work. That said, transplanting shrub seedlings without irrigation, we do see like economically viable establishment. I would say, try to do it in a wet year rather than a dry year if you're doing it without irrigation. But it is viable. Again, to try to do it for a 100,000 acre, 500,000 acre fire in a single year, you're going to run into some very real world limitations on the ability to do that. But I'm a believer, and at the Conservancy, we're trying to build up the capacity both in terms of machinery and human resources to be able to be an effective partner with that at a 5,000 acre a year scale for very targeted areas.
There's about 4 minutes until lunch if folks are committed to another question. Are we keeping you from lunch? I don't think so. No, it starts at 12 technically.
Yeah, looking at potential for success and partnering with what might already be out there, I was wondering if any of you have any observations or strategies in terms of responses from seed dispersers that would be in those ecosystems that have, moving into your restoration sites, or any strategies to encourage seed dispersers to help you out in this work?
Is that a question for everybody? Yeah. Okay.
So seed dispersers being invertebrates and/or ones with backbones, vertebrates. In some of our photos of the mining landscape, when they do reconstruct it, I don't know if you saw all the big rock piles. They're habitat for vertebrate species that move in and out. So they do set up the habitat for those kind of animals. But some of the discussion around seed mix design is about the species that provide the pollinator service to bring the insects in for certain bats that are also regulated to be returned. So although we come from the seed space, the community consideration is being put there because there's already a known food source of the needs of a ghost bat or our vertebrate carnivorous cat. The habitat is being built from that front end, but with the plant community in mind. So that might cover a bit of your query.
Yeah, I'm probably not going to answer the question, but a lot of species are wind dispersed in the Great Basin. I mean, like some sage, for instance, and there's people here in this room that can probably speak to this better than I can, but it seems like a lot of our perennial species, honestly, I don't think a lot of them are animal dispersed, and they don't get very far as a result. So that's an issue. I mean, maybe if we were planting smaller islands of vegetation in larger landscapes, then we could take advantage of that wind dispersal and basically non-animal dispersal better in creating more perennial vegetation in our sites. But yeah, I mean, I guess it depends a lot on your system and exactly the species as to whether the animal dispersal is a thing. On the other hand, like for long-term outcomes, pollination and other animal services start to become a big deal, right? So that you can get more seed set and more seeds from those few species that you do initially establish. So at some level, yeah, insects are a really big deal. I don't know, does anyone else have a response? Like it's a multi-level thing there.
Yeah, for our arid systems, I would echo what Stella says. Animal dispersal is less consideration. Predation is a bigger deal for us actually, and in our our restoration efforts, Elise, if she had been here, would have talked about ants and predation as well as that. But consideration in how those foragers actually do also move and bundle seeds is something that we look at. Is is caching and bundling seeds in a package better than dispersed or spaced seedings of seed. That's something that we certainly take into consideration. But yeah, I'd say in our systems, because we're putting food out there, we're actually trying to keep them off of a lot of that, while at the same time mimicking some of the positive effects they can have. So.
All right, we have run out of time. It's time for lunch. So one more thank you round of applause to our speakers. Thanks, everybody.